illicit drugs should be going up, not down.
Police in Central Texas tell KXAN investigators the state's war on drugs at the border isn't slowing down the flow of drugs into your communities.
And right now we're seeing prices going down.
On some drugs.
Our investigation last night uncovered it's cheaper and easier to buy them than before.
It hasn't taken drugs off our street.
Lawmakers' stated goal is to stop drug and human smuggling by adding hundreds of Department of Public Safety troopers to the border.
But now KXAN investigator Brian Collister reveals your tax dollars are not actually helping the state reach that goal.
Yes, you see, this border surge has truly become a border splurge. Over the past decade, lawmakers have given the DPS about $1.6 billion for these operations, while cutting the budgets of other state agencies. And now DPS is asking for an additional $1 billion in the upcoming legislative session. Tonight, we travel 300 miles south to the border to reveal that very few of the arrest troopers are making there are the smugglers they were sent to catch.
Highway Patrol, put your hands behind your back.
Hands up!
Let's get a K9 to do a search.
Look in the vehicle? Yes. Okay.
Just north of the river bearing the same name, what was once a town rooted in religion and a thriving economy, Rio Grande City now boasts bail bondsmen and legal help to border residents whose every move is being watched closely by an army of state troopers.
Sometimes it's good, and sometimes it's not.
It's not the same place Nellie Mares remembers when she moved her family here 40 years ago.
All my kids are good. They never been in jail.
That all changed one night last year.
They catch him. He couldn't talk, so they called me, to jail. They were gonna lock him up. And I told him, why are you gonna lock him up?
So the reason for your stop, sir, you have your license plate on.
A trooper had pulled over her son Nicholas because his truck had no front license plate.
He was crying.
Nicholas suffered a stroke a few years ago, leaving him unable to speak clearly.
I'm the only one that understands him.
Yeah, only one.
In this dash cam video, the trooper is suspicious.
What's this right here, sir?
Searches and discovers a small bag holding less than 1/3 of a gram of cocaine.
Yeah, put your hands behind your back for me.
He arrests Nicholas on a felony drug charge, what the Texas Department of Public Safety classifies as the apprehension of a high-threat criminal.
I couldn't breathe.
His arrest was added to a massive list of high-threat criminals caught as part of the DPS border surge.
Sustainment of effort, around the clock.
A list DPS uses to justify millions in funding from lawmakers and add even more troopers to this border region. The troopers are every half mile, every mile. You can't go more than 5 minutes without seeing troopers with somebody pulled over. And if DPS gets the additional $1 billion it wants, the number of troopers stationed up and down stretches like Highway 83 will double to 500 to catch even more high-threat criminals. But we discovered troopers don't make very much of those kind of arrests. We analyzed the last 2 years of their arrests and discovered of the more than 32,000 made, just 6% were for felony drug possession and less than 1% were for human smuggling. In fact, the arrest troopers make the most, at 29%, is for drunk driving. Second, misdemeanor drug offenses make up 28%. That means most of what DPS catches are not criminals smuggling drugs into Texas. Instead, they're drug users, like Ruben Escobedo, busted with 1/4 gram of cocaine, or Omar Espinosa, arrested for felony drug possession, but he had only 2 ounces of marijuana. And there's Oscar Lopez, arrested for felony drug possession for a very small amount of cocaine.
Relax. Put your hands behind your back. Put your hands behind your back.
None had a criminal history, but DPS labeled all of them as examples of high-threat criminals.
As a state, we haven't accomplished anything.
State Representative Ryan Guillen's district stretches across Starr County and several others along the border. We showed him what we uncovered.
The biggest thing that has been achieved has been stopping DWIs, which is a good thing. It's a good thing.
But is that border security?
It's not border security, and at what cost did we achieve that, you know?
Ask Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, one of the state's biggest proponents of border security.
The people clearly support this.
He toured the border earlier this year for what he called an accountability update on the massive spending he first proposed while running for office.
It wasn't just a campaign promise I was making because it sounded good to get elected. It was real, and those numbers came from me meeting with the colonel over time saying, what do you need?
The majority of arrests are drunk driving and drug users, essentially, misdemeanor drugs.
The purpose of the increased budget on the border was to reduce all crime.
That's not what DPS reported to lawmakers last year, saying the objective was to decrease cartel drug and human smuggling by increasing patrol presence.
How does this accomplish that?
They're doing their job.
But even though very few of the arrests have to do with smuggling?
Let me tell you something. If the numbers were really high, you would be saying they're not doing their job. Too much is getting in. I don't really understand the point of your story.
They're making very few arrests related to drug smugglers.
Because people who are smuggling the drugs have left that area. DPS said, if you give us the dollars, we can reduce that crime dramatically in that area. We now have proof that crime is some of the lowest it's ever been.
That's not what numbers from DPS show. While felony drug violations do make up a very small number of troopers' total arrests on the border, the amount of those violations has still gone up by 6% in the past 2 years. And a DPS legislative report in 2015 said, at the time, its effort deters cartel smuggling, but it does not secure the border. And patrol operations are inefficient in the detection and interdiction of all smuggling events. The report also notes the Mexican drug cartels know all of this and have hundreds of scouts to help them avoid detection by law enforcement. Still, the lieutenant governor supports spending even more on more troopers.
I talked to the police chiefs, I've talked to the mayors, I've talked to the local officials. They all say keep the money coming, the crime is down.
But we found some local law enforcement, like Hidalgo County Sheriff Eddie Guerra, have mixed feelings.
DPS has been doing a fantastic job, is holding the line on the illegal drugs. But I'm also a taxpayer, and I know that I can do it a lot cheaper.
So we're going to spend money to put troopers all up and down the border.
We will do whatever it takes to make our border safe.
But your tax dollars are going to more than just sending hundreds of troopers down here to the border to make arrests. Millions more are being spent to prosecute those cases, especially here in Starr and Hidalgo counties. But what no one has ever done before is figured out what happened to those arrests. What happens to those court cases? Well, KXAN has spent weeks digging through court files here in the Valley, and what we've uncovered is that in most felony drug cases, the person that's convicted gets nothing more than a slap on the wrist.
Coming up, why this man troopers caught smuggling loads of pot from Mexico twice never went to prison. Plus,
well, we actually been trying to set up an interview with you to show you. What we'd like to do is hold on, that's my microphone.
Lawmakers spending your money on border security refuse to talk about what we uncovered when Border Splurge, a KXAN investigation, continues. A swarm of state troopers deployed along our border to stop the flow of illegal drugs from Mexican cartels. KXAN has revealed DPS is making very few major drug smuggling busts. Instead, the majority of those they arrest are drunk drivers and drug users. But when troopers do actually catch the smugglers, it's up to district attorneys and judges to decide their fate. Texas taxpayers are paying millions for a border prosecution unit KXAN investigator Brian Collister discovered often does not send the worst of these criminals to prison.
This isn't the first time Rolando Garcia has been caught smuggling a massive amount of marijuana. Hidden inside this boat are 240 pounds of weed. You see, he's already on probation after being busted a year before for the exact same thing. Instead of sending him to prison for up to 20 years for the felony drug offense, the prosecutor convinced the judge to just extend Garcia's probation another 2 years. His crime was in Starr County, where along with Hidalgo County, state troopers make most of their border arrests. We spent weeks digging through 500 felony drug arrests in those counties from the past 2 years to find out what actually happened with drug smugglers like Garcia. Of those court cases that are now closed, we found a quarter only got probation, not sentenced to any time behind bars. 33% were sentenced to just a few weeks in jail, with some probation. Like Mary Louise Garcia, who was stopped for speeding in Hidalgo County. The trooper found 638 pounds of pot, but she wasn't sentenced to a single day in jail, only probation.
We are here to help.
The man whose office prosecuted her, Hidalgo County District Attorney Ricardo Rodriguez. He handles more DPS border arrest cases than any other DA in the state.
We've seen some cases where there are very large amounts of drugs, and these people basically just get a slap on the wrist.
Well, there's some that I won't call a slap on the wrist, that get some kind of probation, heavily conditions placed, and there's some that do go to prison.
Then the DA explained the state has money to arrest and prosecute drug smugglers, but not enough to lock all of them up. That's why he usually doesn't recommend prison for nonviolent offenders.
Obviously, they're drug dealers, but when we see the state moving this way, we're following the trend and trying to do everything we can to be able to avoid, spending those kind of monies in our jails, and keeping having room for those egregious offenses where they're really threatening and harming our community.
The local prosecutors make those decisions. As Lieutenant Governor, I don't make the decisions in the grand jury or to the prosecutor.
Are you happy with them putting so many people on probation and not sending them to prison?
I want people who commit crimes to go to jail on the appropriate time based on the crime. I'm not going to sit here and analyze every case. Your question is kind of over the top.
To me, this is demonstrating that you're having success.
But from where these lawmakers sit, the border surge is working. Representative Dennis Bonnen and Senator Brian Birdwell co-chair the state's Joint Committee on Border Security. Both were instrumental in swaying the legislature to approve the most recent round of border funding and are now in charge of making sure it's spent effectively.
They are so grateful to what the Texas State Legislature and Governor have done for them.
The heads of DPS and the Border Prosecution Unit were both at this recent hearing, giving lawmakers statistics about the number of arrests and cases they're handling. But they never go into the specifics, like what we've uncovered. And lawmakers never ask for more details.
The information you gave us today is sufficient for me.
Brian Collister with KXAN. Can I talk to you for a minute, sir?
We tried several times before this hearing to set up interviews to share our findings.
Senator Burwell, can I talk to you for just a minute?
After the meeting, I tried again, but both lawmakers ignored me and my questions.
Well, we actually have been trying to set up an interview with you to show you. What we'd like to do is hold on, that's my microphone.
I don't want being ambushed in halls, sir.
So can we talk to you about how you're spending taxpayer money? You're a public official. You don't want to sit down and talk to the public on camera? They're right there. Can you address those folks?
I am more than happy to receive your report.
We sent him our findings, but he never responded to us.
Can I look in the vehicle? Yep.
Remember high-threat criminal Nicholas Morris? He was arrested on a felony drug charge for less than 1/3 of a gram of cocaine. Prosecutors eventually dropped the charge because he had no criminal record, and Nicholas pled down to just a misdemeanor. Not exactly the drug smuggler that DPS set out to catch.
That's awful.
We requested an interview with DPS Director Steve McCraw, but his office declined. They did send us a statement, though, saying in part, DPS troopers have an obligation to uphold all laws. We are confident that when state leaders and the legislature directed us to implement the ongoing border operation, they did not intend for troopers to ignore other violations of law. Ultimately, the operation's success and need for continued or additional resources for border security will be determined by our state leaders, not the department. You can read the full statement in the investigative section of KXAN.com. And of course, with the legislature meeting in January, they'll be discussing this issue. We'll be monitoring to see how they're going to spend your hard-earned tax dollars on more border security.
And Brian, at the top of the report, we mentioned law enforcement here in Central Texas say They've seen firsthand evidence the state's border surge is not stopping drugs here at home.
Yes, both APD and the DEA here in Austin say the price on many drugs has either gone down or stayed the same, and that means there's actually more drugs readily available.
We know you and our investigative team have been working on this very important report for a long time. Brian, thank you. Online now, Border Splurge, Texas billion-dollar drug war. We break down our team's investigation with interactive features on trooper arrests, state spending, and DPS manpower. Travel with us to the border as the Highway Patrol confronts KXAN.
What station do you work for?
KXAN.
Do you have your ID on you?
Yep.
Plus, we show you the impact drug smugglers are having here at home.
How hard is it to get drugs on the street in Austin?
Easier than waking up in the morning. Easier than buying food.
It's all in the investigative section of KXAN.com right now. And this weekend, we break down the politics behind border security.
At what point does a politician abandon border security as their platform?
Most of the time, people who get elected, they want to get reelected.
They know what a Republican audience wants to hear about in a Republican primary. It's border security and immigration. If you're not talking about it, somebody else will.
Our roundtable of policy experts this Sunday morning on KXAN State of Texas at 8:30. Tonight, Border Splurge, a KXAN investigation. Texas lawmakers have already given about $1.6 billion over the past decade to the Department of Public Safety to keep drugs from coming into Texas.
And now the DPS is asking for another $1 billion in the upcoming legislative session. But top law enforcement here at home tell KXAN investigator Brian Collister the state's border surge is doing little to stop drugs from making their way from Mexico here to Central Texas.
All of my kids would always tell me, he is your favorite. He was this incredibly open-minded, warm person that really had a lot of friends. He was magnetic.
Dylan Massengill was just 21 when his body was found in this overgrown field in North Austin last year. He'd overdosed on heroin.
You don't get phone calls for things like that. They just show up, and I knew it was the worst day of my life to date.
Gina Massengill's son was just one of the many users whose appetite for drugs is fed by narcotics produced by Mexican drug cartels and smuggled into Texas. In the past 2 years, Austin police say their officers have made more than 16,000 drug arrests and seized 41 pounds of heroin, 215 pounds of cocaine, 365 pounds of meth, and 3,000 pounds of marijuana, much of that coming straight from Mexico. On a recent rainy morning, we went with APD's narcotics unit on a drug bust in southeast Austin.
We found a little bit of what we believe is going to be meth, some cocaine.
Sergeant Robbie Volk has worked narcotics on Austin streets for 15 years. I asked him if the state's border surge is cutting down the flow of drugs here.
A decrease? No, I think it's pretty consistent. It's pretty much the same across the board.
The drugs in Central Texas come from here. We're now 300 miles south of Austin along the Texas border with Mexico, where the state is spending hundreds of millions of your tax dollars to put state troopers, hundreds of them, all up and down here. There's one right now. They're here to stop the flow of drugs. DPS says it's been very effective in the two border counties, Hidalgo and Starr, where the majority of its troopers have been deployed. But the agency's own statistics show cartel smugglers are simply going around those counties and into other parts of the state.
It's like a balloon. You squeeze a balloon in the middle, what happens? Whoop, the sides swell up, all right? There's choke points.
Gilbert Gonzalez is executive director of the Texas Narcotics Officers Association, an expert in how the cartels operate.
You're disrupting that, so it causes some reorganization on their part, and it's costing them much more effort to go to remote areas and cross.
But the drugs still get through.
Yes.
And that's why the head of the DEA here in Austin says he's seen no change on the streets.
What impact has the border surge had on the amount of drugs coming across and the price on the street?
From our perspective here in Austin, we haven't seen a major difference.
Except when it comes to price.
And right now we're seeing prices going down?
On some drugs.
Like methamphetamines. Even DPS Director Steve McCraw explained to lawmakers he thinks street price is the best indicator.
If we're only having an impact, the price of drugs should be going up, not down.
Hands up! Hands up! Despite that statement, DPS has never released any intel it has on street prices, so KXAN asked for it. The agency responded with this letter, claiming drug prices have gone up since the surge. But look closely. Their numbers come from just 3 cases involving informants and undercover officers along the most heavily patrolled stretch of the border. It contradicts what other law enforcement agencies, like APD here at home, are seeing on the streets.
You can get an ounce of crystal methamphetamine for, I would say, around $500 or $600, and that's down from maybe $900 or $1,000 for an ounce. You know,
So
over
the price
a
has
couple,
gone down.
So the price has gone down. Using simple economics, there's more supply available than there is the demand for the drug.
Your son didn't have any problem getting access to heroin.
He did not. He did not. Like I said, it was a text or a phone call away.
So all the money the state is putting in to try to take drugs off the street, do you think that's working?
I don't think so. I think that, you know, that maybe it's time to look at some alternative ways to deal with it. I'm not sure what that is. I hope that we can make a difference.
And that's what lawmakers hope to do, to make a difference when they gave DPS millions of your tax dollars. Now, it took us 9 months of digging through records and traveling all the way down to the border to discover your money isn't helping troopers catch that many drug smugglers. In fact, most of the arrests that they make on the border are drunk drivers and small-time drug users. And when they do actually catch the drug smugglers, most of them are not going to prison.
Brian, I know DPS declined your request for an interview, but in an email it explained the strategic goal of its operation is to increase the level of security zone by zone along the border. It says it's a strategy of prevention rather than responding to transnational crime after it reaches our communities. And with a preventive strategy, you can expect to see a number of residual impacts. It's told lawmakers that includes a decrease in the overall amount of drugs smuggled into Texas, but it also says it comes with an increase in drug and human smuggling in adjoining areas.
Some recent drug users say now it's cheaper and easier to get drugs here at home.
My name is Travis. I've been clean and sober for 83 days.
Until just a few weeks ago, this Austin man, who we'll simply call Travis, spent much of his time trying to find drugs to get high. The 27-year-old says he started with marijuana in high school.
There's a constant flow of it, and it usually stays at the same price.
But Travis eventually graduated to crystal meth.
I had smoked meth maybe a month before I went to rehab.
Fresh out of rehab, he knows better than just about anyone how easy it is to find a cheap high.
How hard is it to get drugs on the street in Austin?
I don't think hard is the right word to use. It's more like how easy it is. Easier than waking up in the morning, easier than buying food.
In the past 2 years, state lawmakers have sent hundreds of troopers to patrol the border, in part to attempt to stop the flow of drugs coming in from Mexico, an effort Travis thinks is having no effect.
As a user, as someone who 2.5 months ago was on the street, have you seen any difference in the availability of the drugs that you wanted over the last 2 years?
I'm afraid to say the answer is no. This is going to upset some people, step on their toes, but I don't know what numbers they're running or what field work they've done, but it's never changed for me. I can get it super easy whenever the hell I want. The only reason I'm not doing it now is because I don't want it anymore.
And of course, criminals are going to flee. They're cockroaches. They're bad people.
Drug smugglers coming from Mexico right here to Central Texas, and lawmakers spending your money to send state troopers to the border. They have been and will be major topics at the state capitol, and the success and failure surrounding a border operation can mean major implications for a politician's future, which is why we brought in this panel of experts. Jim Henson from the Texas Politics Project, Sherry Greenberg from the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and our own investigator, Brian Collister. Thank you all for joining us. So one of the things we've been covering in the last couple of weeks is border security and how it relates to our government here in Texas. You know, Brian has been talking to several lawmakers about the funding that has gone down into border security for the Department of Public Safety. It seems like a lot of those you know, those politicians, Dan Patrick, Dennis Bonnen, Brian Birdwell, the people that are talking about border security at the Ledge, they ran on that as a platform. Is that kind of something we're seeing more and more and more? I know it was a big talker in the presidential election.
It's something we've seen more and more over the past decade, I would say. There was a time where in Texas at the state level, it was a very different conversation versus, let's say, California. We didn't have some of the initiatives that you saw in California, but particularly over the past decade, it has been a growing topic in the legislature. We've seen more and more legislation and funding directed towards border security.
What are you hearing from those people that you're talking to about, you know, if you talk to them about campaign promises, that type of thing?
Well, we've sat through a lot of the legislative sessions where the lawmakers have said, this is a top priority, we're going to put down a big check on it, but yet we don't know how to judge its effectiveness. So I think there's a little bit of trepidation probably on the elected politician side of things as once we do figure out the metrics, what are they going to show? So we have to actually wait and see in the legislative session there to vote on what the metrics will be, the standards. Right now we've had some proposals from DPS as to what they should be. So I think really some of them are probably sweating a little bit to make sure that those metrics look good.
Yeah, it's what are we getting for our money? That's right.
You know, and when we talk about going through the presidential election, you've done a lot of polling. How important is border security right now for the electorate?
In a lot of ways, it couldn't be more important. Sherry was talking about how this has risen in the last 10 years, and I think it's about right. And in about the last 8 years of polling that we've done, border security and immigration, when we ask people what is the most important problem facing Texas, consistently 1 and 2. And in terms of the underlying politics at the legislature, if you break that down by party, more than half of Republicans consistently say either immigration or border security are the most important problems facing Texas. And then when you ask them about solutions and what their specific views are, they have very restrictive law and order kind of views about what those solutions are. And I think that's underlying the heat that legislators feel on one hand to drive, you know, into this issue. On the other hand, we're now seeing, I think, a little bit of a tension. As you say, as people have now dumped this money into it, they're coming back, DPS is asking for more money, and you're activating another stream of what Republicans think are important, which is not raising taxes and not spending a bunch of money.
And what did you do with the money I already gave you, right? Yeah, that accountability.
Exactly. And when do voters actually say, this is enough, we got to try something different?
When something else gets their attention. But I think we're kind of in a cycle right now where Republican lawmakers are doing their own polling, and they know what a Republican audience wants to hear about in a Republican primary. It's border security and immigration. If you're not talking about it, somebody else will.
Right.
And when we talk about the legislative session coming up, these are things that they're still going to be discussing. More funding, different approaches to border security.
Yes, but the funding pot is not going to be as robust as they once thought it would, right? With what we saw in the economy, and particularly with oil and gas as of recent times. So they're not going to have as much money as they thought they would at the end of the last session to spend. And no matter how much money you have, it never seems to be enough. People always want more. So how are you going to divide up that pie? And of course, Speaker Strauss has said, as of other lawmakers, that there are dire issues with, for instance, child protective services. So that is an issue that is in the spotlight also right now. And it's one that's expensive because that involves people. It's labor intensive to have those caseworkers, to stem the turnover, to pay them enough. And that is something that's on the front burner right now, as well as the perennial school finance issue. I personally don't believe we will see a major overhaul of the school finance system. It's not something lawmakers want to tackle unless they have to, and the courts have given them a pass at this point.
And clearly you've talked to lawmakers who are critical, who are probably going to be, you know, really fighting to rethink some of that funding measure for border security.
Well, a lot of the critics are on the Democratic side, so they're outgunned. So a lot of them from the border regions have said, you know, my constituents tell me they're feeling harassed. I've got local law enforcement that's telling me that they want the money. So they have to try to get people's attention, and I think if the debate comes down to real credible evidence that the money may not be being spent very effectively, that their influence will grow. If the metrics come out and they're sky high and everybody says, wow, this is a success, then no one's going to listen to them and they'll move on and continue the funding.
Yeah.
At what point does a politician abandon border security as their platform?
Well, Jim is right to point to the polling. Most of the time, people who get elected, they want to get reelected, and all politics is local. They are looking, whether they're in the Senate or the House, at their particular districts and what the polling is showing. Now, if they're not getting the effects that they're looking for, and there starts to be this sentiment of we're wasting money, and I want that money for my local schools and my local law enforcement, and I want something done about child protective services, but it's local, and it's the most local at the House level because those districts are smaller and more localized than the state Senate, but that's what they're going to be looking at.
But while we're in a Republican majority state, the Republicans who are pushing this are probably okay, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think what happens is what's kind of implied over here, that when you have some scarcity in the system, what you do is you provide some degree of cover for people to say no to things. And so I think what you're going to wind up seeing is even some Republicans who have felt a little bit trapped by this issue use this lack of accountability as possible cover to say, we're not going to throw bad money after, good money after bad.
Right.
If we're not getting the kind of results or we're not getting the kind of transparency or assessment that we need, we need to spend enough to keep people safe, and we're going to fight for law and order, but we're not going to throw new money at this until we know more about it. That could provide the cover.
Right.
In a legislative session where you have a lot of scarcity, it gives a lot of people carte blanche to tell people no. Sorry, but
right.
no.
And that's a good point. People think that it's easier for legislators when they have a lot of money, and actually it is a lot easier to just say we don't have any money. No.
Well, and DPS said that it's going to ask for $1 billion next session, and the coverage that we've all seen, there was some collective eye rolling from even people who were all about it last session, and they said, well, wait a minute.
When you mention the B word, billion.
Right, they got a very tepid response.
Well, the other B that I think, if he is still chairman of Ways and Means, or if he is in another committee, Chairman Bonin is going to be somebody who is going to say, you're going to have to show me you need this money.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
Well, we'll leave it there, and maybe we'll have to talk to you guys in a couple of months after the legislative session starts and they start hammering all of this out.
All right. Be delighted.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.